Come on,
Ice
little one!
crystals that pricked my face
way,
like
girl.
tiny needles were carried by the wind, which shrieked across Exmoor like a banshee. When I heard the first piercing crack reverberating from Blackmere Tarn, I should have turned around, but I felt compelled to continue into the storm. What transpired that night altered my entire perspective on bravery, love, and the cost of saving a life. My name is Helena Ashford. Ashford Court's old stone walls had withstood decades of moorland storms, but this one was unique. Even the tough Exmoor ponies had taken refuge in the deepest hollows as the temperature had dropped so quickly that the normally flowing streams had turned to glass. Following what sounded like the frantic whimpering of a trapped animal, I followed the well-travelled trail into the tarn, the beam of my flashlight barely breaking through the swirling snow. My heart almost stopped when I discovered what I did. In the black water where the ice had broken, a pony foal, little older than 6 months, was thrashing. Her eyes rolled white with fear as she struggled to keep her head above the water, her dark bay coat already drenched through. With each step she took, the paper-thin ice surrounding the opening spread spider-web fractures. As I came to terms with the horrifying reality that she was sinking, my breath seized in my throat. "Quick!" I spoke in a whisper, "Easy, girl," but the roaring wind drowned out my voice. My logical side begged me to hurry back to the house, ask for assistance, and adhere to the correct rescue procedures. However, there was no time. With every frantic paddle, I could watch her power ebbing away, her movements slowing as hypothermia took hold. I slid forward on my belly, spreading my weight as evenly as I could, the ice creaking menacingly beneath my boots. I wanted to run to her with all my might, yet one mistake would put us both on the ice. As I reached for the ancient leather halter I kept tied to my belt, a holdover from my early riding days that I'd never bothered to take off, my fingertips were already freezing within my gloves. 20 feet. 15. 10. When the foal's eyes met mine, I saw something that almost made me shatter. She was resigned, not just scared. This untamed animal, bred to roam freely across the moors, was surrendering. I realized I had seconds, not minutes, as her head sunk deeper into the water. I growled through my teeth, "Don't you dare," and sprang forward while holding out the halter. "Don't you dare give up on me now." The ice shattered and moaned under my chest. Hairline fractures spread out like lightning, letting freezing water seep through my jacket. The cold felt like fire as it raced up my arm when my left hand plunged into the water up to the elbow. However, my fingers wrapped in the coarse hair of her sodden mane and gripped it tightly. She initially resisted me, thrashing more violently in fear. I tried to work the halter over her head, but my fingers were so numb that I could not feel the buckles, and the thin edge of the ice bit into my forearms. The black water mixed with blood from where the ice had cut my skin, yet I continued to whisper to her and to cling on. "Don't let go," I said, both to her and to myself. "Please, don't let go." Then something changed in her eyes. Something else replaced the overwhelming fear, either trust or just plain tiredness. Her breath came in sharp, rattling gasps that sent up puffs of steam in the cold air, as she ceased resisting and allowed me to slide the halter into position. It was like attempting to squeeze a wet piano through a keyhole to get her out. Every inch was a struggle against the water's suction, the ice's edge, and my waning strength. As I withdrew from the pit, inch by excruciating inch, dragging this quivering beast toward firm ground, my shoulders screamed in anguish. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it could burst when I collapsed next to her in the snow after we had finally left the danger zone. I could see she was in poor health as she lay there panting and heaving at the sides from the exertion of breathing. Violent tremors ran through her petite body, and her lips were already starting to become bluish. I became aware of the ear tag at that point. I could clearly see the official marking even in the faint light from my flashlight. She was a recognized Exmoor herd, so this wasn't just any wild pony. This meant paperwork, rules, and a whole realm of legal issues that I wasn't ready for. All of that, however, became insignificant as I gazed down at her glazed eyes and ragged breathing. She had to make it through the night now. After taking off my outer jacket, I gathered her in my arms and wrapped it around her as tightly as possible. She weighed more than I had anticipated, perhaps 80 pounds of lifeless weight, but adrenaline gave me power I was unaware I had. Even though it was about half that distance, the walk back to Ashford Court felt like miles. She was barely aware when I rushed through the kitchen door. When I put my ear to her chest, I could hardly hear her heartbeat since her breathing had become shallow and erratic. My sister had always been the sensible one, the veterinarian with steady hands and a sensible head, so Pippa would know what to do. However, I couldn't get rid of the thought that I had just started something that would permanently alter all of our lives as I lay the foal on the thick rug by the Aga and watched her chest rise and fall in a stuttering cadence. In the firelight, I was able to read enough numbers on the ear tag to determine that it belonged to someone, somewhere in the enormous moorland management bureaucracy. There would be calls to make, documentation to submit, and challenging discussions with officials tomorrow who were more concerned with rules than the lifeblood of a scared animal. But tonight, my sister, I, and this little fighter who had miraculously survived long enough to get care were the only three of us. The storm was still raging outside, but we were about to start the most significant struggle of our lives in the little kitchen of Ashford Court. For a brief moment, the foal's eyes opened and met mine with a look I would never forget, recognition, not precisely thanks. Just as I was starting to realize that she had chosen to trust me, she realized that I had chosen to assist her. Together, we would confront whatever happened next. I yelled, "Pippa!" As soon as I rushed through the kitchen door, my knees threatening to break under the weight of the lifeless foal. "Pippa, I need you now." With her auburn hair unkempt from sleep and a heavy cloak around her shoulders, my sister materialized in the doorway like a specter. But as soon as her trained eyes saw me shivering and drenched, clutching what appeared to be a ball of soggy fur, she changed into the veterinarian I had always admired. "Kitchen table, now," she said, her voice slicing like a scalpel through my panic. "Clear everything off." "What happened?" "Found her in Blackmere Tarn," I said as I placed the foal on the enormous wood table that had been in our family's presence for 3 centuries. Ice broke through. She's hypothermic, barely breathing. With the trained precision of someone who has spent years rescuing creatures from the edge, Pippa's hands were already in motion, checking vital signs. While her eyes evaluated the foal's breathing patterns, body temperature, and state of consciousness, her fingers located its pulse sites. Her mouth tightened at what she saw. She said, more to herself than to me, "Core temperature's dangerously low. Pulse is weak and thready." "How long was she in the water?" she asked. As I strained to recall every detail, the words streamed out, "I don't know. Maybe 10 minutes. 15. She was fighting when I found her, but by the time I got her out, she could barely move." After decades of serving as the focal point of Ashford Court's kitchen, the historic Aga stove now served as our lifeblood. As she worked, Pippa started giving quick directions, turning the gathering spot for our family into a makeshift hospital. I took the heavy wool blanket from the hall closet and wrapped it around the foal. "Get every towel in the house," she urged. "And call Barnaby, tell him we need dry kindling and extra coal, fast. This storm's going to knock the power out any minute." The lights flared and died as though she had called them forth. But Pippa had already lighted the oil lamps we kept for emergencies, and the Aga's constant warmth was still radiating outward. Despite the shaking in her hands, she continued her examination while golden light danced across the stone walls. She said, "Helena, look at me," in a softer tone. "This is bad. Really bad. Her body temperature's probably dropped 15 degrees below normal. At this stage, we're looking at potential organ failure, cardiac arrest, respiratory collapse. I wanted to yell at her to simply fix it and stop using such clinical terms, but I could tell that she was afraid. This was my younger sister, who was terrified and struggling to preserve something valuable, not Dr. Philippa Ashford. The rear door sprang open, revealing Barnaby Cooper's bulk and a whirl of snow. After 40 years of farming these moors, our neighbor no longer found anything surprising, with the possible exception of 2 Ashford ladies attempting to revive a half-drowned pony in their kitchen at 2 in the morning. "Heard you might need some help," he said plainly as he placed a supply basket down. Several heavy horse blankets, coal, kindling, and what appeared to be a medical kit. Ben Fletcher's right behind me with the generator. Ben showed up as promised, his forestry background showing in the speed with which he evaluated our makeshift arrangement. In a matter of minutes, they had set up extra lighting and placed the generator outside, its steady hum scarcely perceptible through the downpour. However, I will always remember what transpired next. The foal's feeble, erratic breathing, which had caused me to hold my breath in sympathy, abruptly altered. The quick, frantic exclamations mellowed into a deeper, more steady cadence. With increasing consistency, her flanks rose and fell, and I could hear the faintest whicker when I drew close. With the exception of that priceless sound of life retaliating, the entire room fell silent. Then Pippa lost her cool. As she adjusted the warm lamps Ben magically produced from his truck, her hands, which had been incredibly steady during the emergency operations, started to quiver. I saw my rational, intelligent sister, who could operate on a wounded sheep with ease, battle back tears while keeping an eye on the little animal's vitals. "Come on, little one," she muttered, removing her business mask entirely. "Come on." We were all huddled around the kitchen table, as if we were keeping watch, when Edward Garraway arrived an hour later, fighting his way through the worst of the storm in his vintage Land Rover. After glancing at our temporary intensive care unit, the elderly veterinarian gave us a nod of approval. He commented, "Not bad for field medicine," as he conducted the inspection with his grizzled hands. "Core temp's coming up, pulse is stronger. You've given her a fighting chance, but I won't lie to you, it's still slim." While working in silence, he gave 4 fluids and looked for any indications of pneumonia or other problems. His candor was frightening and comforting. The clinical truth was harsh, but at least he wasn't giving us false hope. As he assembled his medical kit, he added, "The next 12 hours are crucial. Keep her warm, monitor her breathing, and call me if anything changes. I'll check back as soon as the roads are passable." Only after he was gone did I see something that chilled me to the bone. I had uncovered the foal's left rear leg while rearranging the blankets, and there it was, an ancient scar along the cannon bone. It is not the type of injury that would result from playing rough with other foals on a regular basis. This was purposeful, exact, as if she had been entangled in a rope or a wire. I muttered, "Pippa," and gestured to the mark. "Look at this." Her look became more worried as she used her flashlight to check the scar. I could see her thinking as she trailed off, saying, "This wasn't from tonight. It's old, maybe a month or 2. And the pattern. What is it? It looks like she was caught in something. Snare, maybe, or got tangled in old fencing wire. But the way it healed, she broke free on her own." Pippa's tone was gloomy. "Helena, this little one has been through hell before tonight." The ramifications struck me like a force of nature. There was more to this than a young pony approaching fragile ice too closely. This filly had previously experienced rejection, injury, and having to fend for herself in one of the most hostile places in England. It makes sense why she had been so isolated from the main herd, leaving her vulnerable and alone throughout the storm. Our patient awakened as dawn started to peek through the kitchen windows, illuminating everything with a silvery, pale glow. For the first time since I had dragged her out of the tarn, her eyes were fully open, and they were bright, alert, and brimming with an intellect that left me speechless. As though learning our faces by heart, she glanced at me, Pippa, Barnaby, and Ben in turn. I got the same rush of connection I had at the frozen pond when her eyes found me. Acknowledgement, perhaps even appreciation. I muttered, "Hello, little one," being cautious not to touch her. "You made it through." She attempted to raise her head, succeeded for a few seconds, and then lowered herself again with what I thought was a satisfied sigh. Somehow, the kitchen had a new purpose and seemed different. What had begun as a last-ditch rescue was turning into something else. I couldn't get rid of the thought of that ear tag or the questions it brought up, despite the relief that washed over me. Somewhere in the intricate web of bureaucracy and moorland management, this foal belonged to someone. The simple part had been saving her life. The real test was about to begin. 3 days after we had retrieved our little fighter from the ice, the phone call arrived at 7 in the morning. Although she was still merely a number in someone's ledger, I had begun referring to her as Bracken, like the untamed ferns that covered the moor. That was about to change. My stomach knotted as I heard the clear, businesslike voice say, "Lady Ashford. This is Miss Rowan Tate, local register for the Exmoor Commons. I understand you've recovered one of our registered ponies." I tightened my hold on the phone and watched Bracken standing unsteadily in the makeshift pasture Ben had set up back the house through the kitchen window. Although she was stronger now and her coat was starting to return to its original sheen, she was still delicate in a way that made my chest hurt. Yes, we found her in Blackmere Tarn during the storm. She would have died if... Miss Tate softly interrupted, saying, "I'm sure you acted with the best intentions. But we need to discuss the legal requirements for housing an unregistered Exmoor pony. There are protocols, health checks, documentation that must be completed within 7 days of recovery." 7 days. The words struck me like a blow to the body. Day 3 had already begun. Even though I already knew the answer, I nevertheless inquired, "What exactly does that mean?" "It means she needs proper identification papers, current health certificates, and proof of authorized grazing rights. Without those, she'll need to be transferred to a holding facility until the next scheduled drift." The subsequent slide. Ponies were separated, examined, and either restored to the moor or permanently removed, during the yearly roundup. I had previously observed these activities from a distance and knew how important they were to maintaining the historic grazing rights that maintained the equilibrium of Exmoor's ecosystem. However, I had never thought that I would have to give up a creature that I had actually saved from death. "Miss Tate," I stated with care, "this foal was abandoned. She has old injuries suggesting she'd been rejected by her herd, and she was alone when I found her. Surely there are provisions for..." She said, "I'm afraid the law doesn't recognize abandonment as grounds for private custody," and her voice had a tone of sincere remorse. "The Exmoor ponies are considered semi-feral livestock with specific owners and grazing rights. Every animal must be accounted for." I felt as like the walls were closing in on me as I sat in the empty kitchen after she hung up, promising to come by within the week to finish her assessment. This was a countdown to losing something I had recently discovered, not merely bureaucracy. An hour later, Pippa saw me there, gazing over the formal documents that Miss Tate had indicated sending. I felt as though another collar was being put around Bracken's neck as the legal jargon swam before my eyes: unregistered equine, temporary holding, seasonal management protocols. "Helena?" Pippa asked in a gentle, wary tone. "What's wrong?" Without saying anything, I gave her the documents. As she read the specifications, the due dates, and the consequences for non-compliance, I saw a change in her expression. She slumped onto the chair across from me after finishing and putting them down. "There has to be something we can do," she finally stated. "Some legal avenue, some exception." "Read paragraph 7, I retorted. She discovered it and heard it read, "Ponies recovered during emergency situations must be processed through standard drift procedures to ensure genetic diversity, prevent disease transmission, and maintain sustainable grazing loads." Christ, Helena, they're talking about her like she's livestock. That's exactly what she is, legally speaking. I felt like I was eating ashes after making that revelation. We don't get to keep her just because we saved her life. The true worry that had been building since that first night, however, was what I chose not to express that hovered between us. What if she wasn't wanted back by Bracken's original herd? What if she had previously experienced rejection, as evidenced by the old wounds on her leg? A foal that was unable to keep up or blend in became a liability that the herd could not afford in the harsh economics of moorland survival. My thoughts were about to spiral out of control when I heard tires on gravel. I saw a sleek black Range Rover arrive at our front door through the window. The man who appeared was Lord Percival Harrington, the biggest private landowner in our area of Exmoor, and he saw the moor's antiquated customs as barriers to contemporary productivity. He was all I had feared and anticipated. "When I opened the door," he said, "Lady Ashford," with a calculating and icy smile, "I heard about your recent acquisition. Thought I might stop by to discuss the situation." Harrington had never waited for an invitation, but I didn't ask him in. His pricey boots clicked like a countdown as he raced past me, and into the corridor. He went on, "Tragic business, this storm," taking off his leather gloves with dramatic accuracy. "Lost several head myself. But that's the nature of moorland farming, brutal, unforgiving, utterly unsentimental." I interrupted his performance to ask, "What do you want, Percival?" His teeth, which likely cost more than most people's cars, expanded his smile. "Straight to the point. I always admired that about your family. What I want, Helena, is to help you understand the reality of your situation." He pulled a folder out of his bag and laid papers out on our kitchen table like a card dealer. "Economic forecasts, ecological evaluations, and property surveys are all leading to the same conclusion." He uttered the words, "The current pony population on Exmoor is unsustainable," with the polished rhythm of a business meeting. "Overgrazing, genetic bottlenecking, increased mortality rates during severe weather events. The compassionate thing, the responsible thing, is to reduce herd sizes to manageable levels." "Manageable for whom?" Pippa said, emerging from the doorway holding Bracken's medical records tightly. When Harrington said, "For everyone, Dr. Ashford. The ponies, the ecosystem, the local economy." His eyes glistened with what may have been sincere passion. "I'm proposing a comprehensive modernization of moorland management. Selective breeding programs, climate-controlled facilities, professional veterinary care." I cut you off, "You're talking about domestication. These ponies have roamed free for 1,000 years. And look where that's gotten them," he retorted, his polite exterior beginning to falter. His eyes darted to the window where Bracken was visible in her makeshift paddock, and he read, "Starving in winter, drowning in storms, producing weak offspring that can't survive without human intervention." Case in point. Part of the charge was accurate, so it struck close to home. Not because she had shown that she could survive in the wild, but because we had stepped in, Bracken was still alive. However, there was a certain satisfaction in Harrington's voice when he talked about lowering herd numbers, and it made me shudder. He added, pulling another document out of his folder. "There's something else you should know," he said. "I've petitioned the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to move up this year's drift schedule. Citing the recent storm damage and disease concerns, we should be able to conduct preliminary roundups within the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks. As the ramifications became evident, my heart fell. We would run out of time before the bureaucracy could act in our favor, even if we could manage the legal criteria for temporarily detaining Bracken. Pippa objected, "You can't just decide to accelerate a centuries-old tradition," but Harrington simply shook his head. He made a hazy gesture toward the storm-damaged countryside that was visible through our windows and said, "Actually, I can. As the largest private stakeholder in the affected grazing rights, I have considerable influence over scheduling. And given the current circumstances, well, emergency protocols tend to streamline decision-making processes." Following his announcement that he would help us through this difficult transition, I stood at the kitchen sink and gazed out at Bracken. Even though she had become stronger in the last several days, she was still little, defenseless, and scarred by whatever trauma had initially caused her to be removed from her herd. I was joined at the window by Pippa, who appeared pale and tense in the glass reflection. "Helena," she said, "what if we're fighting for the wrong thing?" "What do you mean?" The words seemed choked, as if they were literally painful to utter. What if saving her life means letting her go? What if keeping her here, fighting this legal battle, is just our way of avoiding the hard truth? As I looked at her, I noticed that her eyes mirrored my own tormented thoughts. Which is? That maybe love isn't about holding on. Maybe it's about knowing when to let go. With her ears perked up as though she could hear something we couldn't, Bracken raised her head toward the moor beyond. Across the wide stretches of heather and grass, the wind carried the distant sound of other ponies calling to one another. Her response was a brief, optimistic whinny that seemed to reverberate off Ashford Court's old stones. The realization that Pippa was correct caused something within of me to shatter. Bracken wasn't learning to be wild every day that we kept her here, safe and secure. She was still having trouble figuring out where she fit into the intricate social framework that had supported her race for thousands of years. But I made a commitment that would alter everything as I lifted the ear tag up to the light and read the official numbers that turned her into a mere bureaucratic entry. Bracken would not vanish into some holding facility, no matter what transpired over the next few weeks. She would not fall victim to Harrington's efficiency tactics once more. I was going to find a method, somehow, that respected the law and the fiery independence that was her birthright, despite the possibility of losing her in the process. Over the course of its 3 centuries, Ashford Court's Great Hall had seen many gatherings, but none quite like this one. Outside, snow continued to blanket the moor in immaculate silence, while crystal chandeliers danced shadows on stone walls that had protected my ancestors through famines, wars, and social upheavals. Either the start of something remarkable or the dignified funeral of all I valued would take place inside those same walls tonight. As she adjusted the antique mirror beside the entrance where people would congregate, Pippa inquired for the 3rd time, "Helena, you're sure about this?" Her hands were shaking as she placed the gift cards on the welcome table, but she was wearing her mother's emerald dress, the one that made her eyes green. "No," I said as I smoothed my own gown's fabric. "But certainty is a luxury I can't afford right now." I could see the first headlights coming up our drive through the large windows. Members of Parliament, local landowners, conservation organization officials, and journalists who had learned about our rescue controversy were all attending what I had advertised as a winter charity ball. In reality, they would discover a hybrid of a public confession, a battle cry, and a fundraiser. As visitors arrived, the string quartet started to perform, and they spoke with a mixture of polite cynicism and curiosity. The majority of the faces I recognized belonged to the people in charge of Exmoor's political and economic future. Their backing may mean the difference between Bracken being saved and her being lost to bureaucratic efficiency. Lady Ashford, called Margaret Thornfield, a parliamentarian from the area whose district encompassed half of the woodland. I understand you've been having quite an adventure with wildlife rescue. Something like that, I said, taking her offer of an air kiss. Though I'd call it more of an education in the gap between doing what's right and following what's legal. Her brows went up a little. Such a comment was either dangerously foolish or refreshingly honest in political circles. I was placing all of my money on the former. Naturally, Lord Harrington arrived fashionably late, escorted by a small group of guys in pricey clothes who appeared to have never been on real moorland. With a champagne glass in hand, he walked up with a smile that was all teeth and calculation. He exclaimed, "Helena, my dear, what a delightful surprise," in a voice that could be heard by people close. "I do hope tonight's festivities won't interfere with our recent discussions about proper animal management." "On the contrary, Percival," I answered, raising my voice to match his. "I think you'll find tonight very educational." Small conversation and strategic placement dominated the dinner. I had arranged the visitors in a clever manner, placing doubters across from ardent believers, journalists next to sympathetic benefactors, and conservationists next to pragmatic farmers. The crowd hummed with an excitement I could feel in my bones by the time we got to the evening's speaking part. Standing at the head table, I gazed out at faces that symbolized contemporary political power, centuries of English tradition, and everything in between. In the back of my mind, I could hear Bracken laughing quietly in her makeshift corral, believing that we would figure something out. I said, "Ladies and gentlemen," clearly audible over the abrupt silence. "Thank you for joining us on what I know is a difficult night to travel. But then, the most important journeys are rarely convenient." There were a few courteous giggles, but their eyes were full with inquiries. This was not your typical charity speech about tax breaks and deserving causes. A week ago, I pulled a dying foal from the ice at Blackmere Tarn. That act of rescue has since become a legal challenge, a political debate, and according to some, a flagrant violation of centuries-old traditions. I took a moment to digest that. Tonight, I want to talk about what it means to honor tradition while embracing change. I motioned to Pippa, who got up and walked over to the old escritoire that held our family's records. Her hands were firm as she raised a piece of parchment that had been meticulously kept for years under glass. "This letter was written by my great-great-grandfather, Colonel James Ashford, in 1847, I went on. He was facing similar questions about land use, tradition, and responsibility. With your permission, I'd like to read his words." As Pippa gave me the document, the entire room fell silent. The handwriting was exquisite despite the weight of the decisions it chronicled, and the faded ink was still readable even in the candlelight. "To my descendants who may one day face the choice between convenience and conscience, I read out loud, let it be known that Ashford Court exists not for the comfort of its inhabitants, but for the preservation of the wild places that define our character as a people. The moor does not belong to us, we belong to the moor. And our first duty is not to profit from its bounty, but to ensure its continuation for those who come after." I raised my head, looking around the room. A number of people had leaned forward, eagerly awaiting each word. Others appeared uneasy, as though they had unintentionally entered a more intimate situation than they had anticipated. He wrote those words during the Highland clearances, when economic pressure was forcing thousands of people and animals from land their families had occupied for centuries. He chose to maintain the traditional grazing rights that allowed Exmoor ponies to roam freely, even though converting to sheep farming would have been far more profitable. Margaret Thornfield nodded slowly, obviously sensing the historical similarity I was pointing out with her political instincts. I said, "Today, we face similar pressures," as my voice grew louder. "Economic arguments for modernizing moorland management. Efficiency experts who see wild ponies as obstacles to development. Legal frameworks that reduce living creatures to registration numbers and processing schedules." Harrington's face tensed, and I could see his fingers tapping his champagne flute. The foal we rescued, I've named her Bracken, represents more than one life saved from drowning. She represents a choice we must make as a community. Do we value the wild heart of this place, or do we surrender it to the spreadsheet mentality that turns everything into a business proposition? Murmurs broke out throughout the room, some in agreement, some obviously uneasy. Before anyone could stop me, I continued. I'm not asking you to break the law. I'm asking you to help me find a legal path that honors both our responsibilities and our heritage. Tonight, I'm announcing the establishment of the Ashford Moor Conservation Fund, a private initiative to supplement public resources for wildlife rescue, habitat preservation, and emergency intervention. Pippa came forward and set a leather-bound ledger on the table next to me. Every pound donated tonight will go directly toward creating a sustainable model for balancing conservation with regulation. We're not fighting the system, we're trying to evolve it. The reaction was swift and tremendous. First to stand, Margaret Thornfield took out her checkbook. "Put me down for £5,000, she said publicly. It's time we stopped talking about heritage and started investing in it. Others trailed behind, some cautiously, some surprisingly enthusiastically. I expected the guests to be against the idea, but they seemed to be caught up in the momentum. But everything was altered by what transpired next. I didn't recognize the old man who got up from a table near the back. He was tall and weathered, with a permanent tan from working outside for decades. His voice had the characteristic accent of someone who had spent his whole life on Exmoor. "Begging your pardon, Lady Ashford," he responded, "but I think there's something you should know about that little pony of yours." With everyone's attention on this unexpected speaker, the room fell silent once more. "Name's Tom Whitlock. I've been working these moors for 60 years, and I knew that foal's mother. Saw her running with the Dunkerry herd until she went missing during last month's storm. Had a star marking on her forehead, just like your Bracken." My heart stopped beating. If Bracken's mother was known, if her family history was documented. He shrugged, leaving the implication unspoken. "The thing is," Tom went on, "there's an old bridleway that runs from your property straight through to National Trust land. It's been sealed up for decades, but the right-of-way is still legal. If someone were to open that passage." Under the table, Pippa's hand touched mine, her hold firm with equal parts fear and excitement. "Are you saying," I inquired carefully, "that there might be a legal route for Bracken to reach protected grazing land?" What could have been a smile creased Tom's weathered face. "I'm saying your ancestor wasn't the only one who believed the moor belongs to itself. Some of us have been keeping track of the old ways, waiting for someone with the courage to use them." As the ramifications became apparent, the room hummed with new vitality. A legitimate route to liberty, not only for Bracken but possibly for any pony ensnared in comparable situations. With a voice full of emotion that I no longer attempted to conceal, I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've just witnessed the birth of something truly special. Not just a rescue fund, but a bridge between past and future." I felt the weight of both hope and history as I picked up the pen next to the ledger. With a flourish, I signed my name and declared, "The Ashford family pledges £10,000 to establish this fund. And more importantly, we pledge to use every legal means at our disposal to ensure that creatures like Bracken have a chance to live as nature intended." Pippa leaned near my ear as guests waited in line to add their own commitments. She muttered, "You realize what you've done? You've just made this about more than one foal. You've made it about the soul of this place." I could see stars starting to emerge between the clouds through the large windows. Unaware that her rescue had become the impetus for something much bigger, Bracken was somewhere out there relearning how to be wild. However, I realized we had gone too far tonight as I saw the donations mount and sensed the atmosphere change from doubt to dedication. Simple, silent compliance with systems that prioritized efficiency over wonder would never be possible again. The actual conflict was only getting started. On a clear morning when the heather was still covered in frost, Jocelyn Greenfield arrived at Ashford Court with what appeared to be more scientific equipment than conventional horse training equipment. Her weathered face mapped years of patient observation on the moor, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had studied semi-feral ponies' behavior for decades. As she placed her canvas bag next to Bracken's paddock, she stated, "The first thing you need to understand is that we're not training her to be domestic. We're helping her remember how to be wild." The sound of a new voice made Bracken raise her head, and I saw her ears perk up cautiously. There was still something unmistakably tame about her posture, even though she had become stronger over the previous week. Her coat was glossy, and her movements were more fluid. She was too trusting of people, too willing to look them in the eye, and too close to the fence. "She's bonded with you," Jocelyn noted, pointing out that Bracken positioned herself in my direction even as she studied this newcomer. "That's both our biggest challenge and our greatest asset." After the charity ball, my sister had gone into research mode, reading everything she could find about the behavior of wild horses, social structures, and rehabilitation methods. Pippa came out of the house with a thermos of tea and her ubiquitous notebook, ready to record every facet of what Jocelyn referred to as respectful rewilding. "Dr. Ashford," Jocelyn said with a nod. "I've read your preliminary medical reports. Excellent work keeping her alive, but now we need to teach her skills that might keep her alive long-term in the wild." The procedure started out easily enough. Jocelyn started what she called pressure and release exercises at the far end of the field rather than going straight to Bracken. When the filly gave the right response, she would lift her arms, making Bracken step back, then instantly lower them, and take a step back. Jocelyn added, "Wild ponies live by reading body language and energy," while she was at work. Everything from the position of ears to the tension in shoulders communicates intent, dominance, submission, danger. Domestic handling teaches them to ignore these signals in favor of human cues. I was holding my breath while I observed Bracken's reactions progressively change from perplexity to comprehension. Bracken stepped aside as Jocelyn stepped forward with determined intensity. Bracken would approach carefully when she relaxed and turned sideways, creating a less intimidating profile. Jocelyn whispered, "See how she's starting to read my intent before I fully express it. That's survival instinct awakening. In the wild, the pony who waits to see what the predator intends is the one who gets caught." The feeding exercises, however, were what really put our willpower to the test. Jocelyn dispersed hay in several little piles across the paddock in place of the twice-daily bucket feeding Bracken had become used to, which made her continually move and compete with herd mates in her mind for resources. She clarified that wild ponies spend the majority of their waking hours foraging. They move an average of 10 miles per day, never staying in one spot long enough to become complacent. Comfort kills wild animals faster than any predator. The ban on human touch was the most difficult aspect. Jocelyn created what she referred to as no-touch zones, certain separations that people couldn't go without Bracken intentionally stepping aside. No more hand-feeding treats, no more casual touching, and no more of the physical tenderness that had bonded us to her during those crucial first few days. Jocelyn said, "This is where most rescue attempts fail," as she observed me burying my hands deep in my jacket pockets to hide my want to reach out. People fall in love with the gratitude, the trust, the feeling of being needed. But wild animals don't need our love, they need our respect. I struggled, but Pippa struggled much more. As Bracken walked toward the fence line where she was standing, I saw her face fall into a crumple, obviously anticipating the kind words and tender touches that had become their daily ritual. Bracken appeared very perplexed when Pippa purposefully moved away, keeping the recommended space. Jocelyn noticed Pippa's tears and whispered softly, "It's okay to grieve. What you're doing right now, choosing her welfare over your emotional needs, that's the hardest part of loving something wild." Jocelyn's strategies, however, went beyond merely changing behavior. She provided recordings of the vocalizations of Exmoor ponies, which included the delicate snorting, whinnying, and nickering that made up their intricate communication system. Bracken learned to react to auditory cues that could indicate everything from impending danger to a social invitation by listening to these noises, which were played at various levels and frequencies. Jocelyn stated, her mother would have taught her this language, while we listened to the eerie, uncanny calls resonating throughout the paddock. Each herd has its own dialect, its own warning systems. We're trying to give her the basics that might help her integrate with any group she encounters. The fragrance work was as painful as it was fascinating. Jocelyn had gathered samples from a variety of Exmoor herds, including soil from places where ponies frequently rolled, dried feces and hair fragments. She dispersed these across Bracken's area while seeing how intently the filly examined each new scent. Smell is their primary sense for identifying family, territory, danger, and reproductive status, Jocelyn wrote in her field diary, noting her meticulous findings. She's cataloging information that could mean the difference between acceptance and rejection by a wild herd. We discovered something during one of these fragrance exercises that completely altered our approach. To gain a better understanding of Bracken's native range, Ben Fletcher had installed trail cameras around the perimeter of the property to record the movement patterns of wild ponies. We gathered around Pippa's laptop anticipating standard film of deer, foxes, and possibly the occasional badger when he produced the memory cards for examination. Rather, we discovered something remarkable. "There," Jocelyn replied, gesturing to the screen where, only 2 days after the storm, a timestamp read 3:17 a.m. "Do you see that shadow moving through the trees?" Trying to make sense of the dark figures moving at the edge of the camera's field of view, I squinted at the blurry night vision film. My breath caught when the figure came into sharper focus. The mare was obviously an Exmoor pony, but even in the dim light, the characteristic scarring over her right flank was noticeable. There was a sense of desperation in her actions, but she proceeded with the usual caution of a wild animal exploring known ground. She continued to circle back to the same spot, whickering softly and inquiringly. "She's searching," Pippa said in a low voice. "She's looking for something." I glanced toward the paddock where Bracken was practicing the startle and flee reactions Jocelyn had been teaching her, and thought, or someone. Referring to her phone logs, Jocelyn stated, "The scarring pattern matches descriptions in the Exmoor Pony Society database. This is likely Moorwind, registered to the Dunkerry herd, reported missing during the same storm system that nearly killed Bracken." All of us were suddenly struck by the ramifications. Everything we were doing became even more urgent if this was Bracken's mother, if she had made it through the storm and was actively looking for her missing foal. Not only were we getting Bracken ready for anonymous integration with a random herd, but we might also be bringing a family that had been split up by a natural calamity back together. Despite my fear of the response, I inquired, "How long do mares typically search for lost offspring?" "Depends on the individual, and the circumstances," Jocelyn said thoughtfully in response. She paused and looked at the video once more. "Some abandon the search within days. Others," she said. "Others will keep looking until they find evidence of death or successful integration elsewhere." We viewed the film 3 more times, paying close attention to the mare's personality, health, and gait. Every viewing demonstrated that this was deliberate searching by a woman who had not given up hope, not haphazard wandering. Ben said, "There's something else," as the video cut to a different scene. "Watch this." Nearly an hour and a half later, at 4:45 a.m., the timestamp was displayed. When the same mare reappeared, she wasn't by herself. A smaller pony, most likely a yearling, followed at a polite distance, approaching with the circumspect deference of a lower-ranking herd member. "Sibling," said Jocelyn right away. "Or possibly a cousin. The herd structure is still intact, which means Bracken has family actively looking for her." Something changed within me, like the realignment of tectonic plates. This was no longer about a single rescued foal. This was about restoring more than just surviving, it was about repairing a wound in the natural order. "Show her the footage," I abruptly remarked. "Helena?" Pippa asked in a bewildered manner. "Show Bracken the footage. If that's really her mother, she should recognize the calls, the movement patterns, something." Jocelyn gave a slow nod. "It's worth trying. Foals imprint on their mother's vocalizations very early. Even traumatic separation doesn't completely erase that recognition." The laptop was positioned close to Bracken's paddock, and the audio from the night vision recordings was played. It was an instantaneous and devastating response. At the first whinny in the distance, Bracken's head sprang up, and her ears turned to follow the sound. She started to pace the fence line while frantically yelling into the speakers. With firmness, Jocelyn stated, "That's recognition. That's not general equine interest, that's specific, personal recognition." Pippa was crying openly now, but not with sadness. These were tears of something approaching joy, the kind of emotion that comes when a seemingly impossible hope suddenly transforms into achievable reality. "So what do we do now?" I asked, watching Bracken continue her agitated responses to her mother's recorded calls. "Now," Jocelyn said, "we prepare her for the most important test of her life. We need to make sure she's ready to survive not just as an individual, but as a member of a wild family that's been waiting for her to come home." But as we made our plans for Bracken's eventual reunion with her mother, none of us suspected that time was running out faster than we'd imagined. The legal machinery set in motion while Lord Harrington's early drift proposal was already grinding toward a conclusion that would force our hand in ways we weren't prepared for. The next few days would test everything we'd learned about the balance between love and letting go. The phone call came at dawn, cutting through the crisp morning air like a blade. I fumbled for the receiver, still half asleep, until Ms. Rowan Tate's voice shocked me fully awake. "Lady Ashford, I'm calling with urgent news. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs has approved Lord Harrington's petition for an emergency drift. We have less than 48 hours before the collection teams arrive." 48 hours. The words echoed in my mind as I stared out at Bracken, who was practicing her new independence exercises with Jocelyn in the early morning mist. She looked stronger now, more alert, her movements carrying the fluid grace of a wild creature. But was she ready for what was coming? "There's more," Ms. Tate continued, her professional composure cracking slightly. "The operation has been classified as a disease prevention measure. Any ponies found outside designated areas will be subject to immediate quarantine protocols." I sank into the kitchen chair, the full implications hitting me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Bracken anymore, this was about every semi-feral pony on our section of the moor, including the scarred mare we believed to be her mother. "How much time do we actually have?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be impossibly short. "The advance teams start reconnaissance tomorrow. Full collection begins the following morning." Her voice softened. "Helena, I want you to know this isn't how I wanted things to proceed. But with the disease concerns and the weather damage." "I understand," I said, though understanding and accepting were two entirely different things. "Thank you for the warning." After I hung up, the kitchen felt suffocatingly small. Through the window, I could see Pippa emerging from the stable with her morning medical check clipboard, Ben adjusting camera positions to monitor the property perimeter, and Jocelyn working patiently with Bracken on flight response drills. None of them knew that our careful timeline had just been shattered. I found myself thinking about the bridleway Tom Whitlock had mentioned at the charity ball, the ancient right-of-way that connected our property to National Trust land. We'd been researching its legal status, hoping to use it as a long-term solution. Now it might be our only immediate option. Helena. Pippa's voice interrupted my spiraling thoughts. You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, I replied, and explained the phone call. I watched my sister's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of steely determination I hadn't seen since our father's death. 48 hours, she repeated, her scientific mind already calculating logistics. Can we get her ready in time? We have to, I said. Because the alternative is watching them load her into a transport truck, and we both know where that leads. Jocelyn took the news with the calm acceptance of someone who'd spent decades watching bureaucracy clash with nature. But when she thought we weren't looking, I caught her wiping her eyes as she watched Bracken respond to her training exercises with increasing confidence. She's not fully ready, Jocelyn said quietly. Another week, maybe 2, and she'd have a real chance. But right now. She shrugged, the gesture carrying years of hard-won wisdom. Right now, she's got heart and basic instincts. Sometimes that has to be enough. Ben's news about the bridleway was both encouraging and terrifying. The legal research he'd done with Tom Whitlock confirmed that the right-of-way was still valid, technically accessible, and would put anyone using it on National Trust land, outside the jurisdiction of Harrington's emergency drift. The gate mechanism is original Victorian engineering, Ben explained, showing us photographs of the rusted ironwork. Tom's grandfather was the last person to use it regularly, back in the 1960s. But the key still exists. He produced a massive iron key from his jacket pocket, its surface pitted with rust but its teeth still sharp and defined. One problem, he continued. Once we open that gate, there's no closing it quietly. Anyone monitoring the area will know exactly what we've done and when. How long before the drift teams would reach National Trust boundaries? I asked. According to the operational schedule Ms. Tate shared, they'll sweep private lands first, then move to the commons, Ben replied. If we can get Bracken across before they start the initial reconnaissance. It's not just about getting her across, Pippa interrupted, her voice tight with emotion. It's about whether she can survive on her own once she's there. All of Jocelyn's training, all our preparation, we're still asking a 6-month-old foal to navigate complex social hierarchies with wild herds she's never met. The weight of what we were contemplating settled over all of us like a heavy blanket. We weren't just opening a gate, we were severing the last threads of human protection that had kept Bracken alive since that night at Blackmere Tarn. There's something else, I said, the words coming out more difficult than I'd expected. If we do this, if we open that bridleway, we're committing to letting her choose. Even if she wants to come back, even if she gets scared or confused, we can't interfere. Pippa's medical notebook slipped from her hands, pages scattering across the kitchen table. You're talking about potentially watching her die, she whispered. I'm talking about giving her the chance to live, I replied, though the distinction felt paper-thin. Really live, not just survive in human captivity. Barnaby arrived as we were debating logistics, his weathered face grim with news from the village. Harrington's been busy, he reported, settling into his usual chair. Word is he's already got buyers lined up for ponies that don't make the cut for return to the moor. Private collectors, training facilities, even some talking about meat processing. The room went deadly quiet. Meat processing. The words hung in the air like a curse, transforming our abstract discussion about freedom and wildness into a stark calculation about life and death. That settles it, Pippa said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We opened the gate. But it was Jocelyn who articulated what we were all thinking. You realize what this means? She asked quietly. If we're right about the scarred mare being her mother, if that family group is still searching the area, we might be orchestrating a reunion. But if we're wrong, if Bracken can't find or integrate with any wild herd. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood the stakes. That evening, I found myself standing at the paddock fence watching Bracken practice the independence skills that might soon mean the difference between life and death. She'd grown so much from the half-drowned foal I'd pulled from the ice, but she still looked impossibly young and vulnerable against the vast expanse of moorland beyond our property. Second thoughts? Pippa asked, joining me at the fence. Third and fourth thoughts, I admitted. But not changing my mind. Why not? I considered the question, watching Bracken execute a perfect flight response to one of Jocelyn's simulated predator approaches. Because keeping her safe isn't the same as keeping her alive, I said finally. And because I think she deserves the chance to be what she was born to be, even if it's dangerous. Even if we lose her. Even then. That night, we made our final preparations. Ben positioned himself with night vision equipment to monitor the bridleway and surrounding area. Jocelyn conducted one last training session, focusing on calls and responses that might help Bracken locate other ponies in the National Trust lands. Pippa completed a final medical assessment, confirming that Bracken was as physically ready as we could make her. And I sat in my father's old study, writing letters I hoped I'd never have to send, explanations to authorities, statements for the press, legal documentation of our actions and reasoning. As I sealed the final envelope, I realized we'd reached the point where turning back was no longer possible. Tomorrow, we would open a gate that had been closed for 60 years. We would release a creature we'd learned to love into a world that offered no guarantees. But as I looked out at the moonlit moor, listening to the distant calls of wild ponies moving through the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that night at Blackmere Tarn, the certainty that we were doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. This is the price of freedom, Barnaby had said earlier, his hand heavy on my shoulder. For her and for us. Tomorrow, we would all discover exactly how much we were willing to pay. The countdown had begun, and there was no stopping it now. The morning after we learned about the early drift, I woke to the sound of machinery. Not the familiar rumble of farm equipment or the distant hum of traffic, but something harsh and industrial that made my blood run cold. Ben Fletcher stood in our back pasture at dawn, setting up what looked like a torture chamber for ponies. "This is going to hurt us more than it hurts her," he said grimly, adjusting a collection of devices that seemed designed to terrify rather than train. Air horns, diesel generators, strips of reflective tape that caught the morning light like strobing warnings. But if she's going to survive out there, she needs to be afraid of humans. All humans. I understood the logic, even as my heart rebelled against it. Every instinct I'd developed over the past weeks screamed at me to protect Bracken from stress, to keep her calm and confident. Now we were about to systematically destroy that trust in the name of keeping her alive. The drift teams use vehicles, noisemakers, and high-visibility gear to herd ponies, Jocelyn explained as she positioned speakers around the paddock perimeter. If she associates those sounds with safety or curiosity instead of immediate flight, she'll be caught in the first sweep. Pippa emerged from the house with her medical kit, though we all knew there was nothing in there that could treat what we were about to do to Bracken's psyche. She'd been quiet since yesterday's phone call, her usual scientific detachment replaced by something raw and wounded. "Are we sure about this?" she asked, watching Bracken graze peacefully in the morning sun, unaware that her world was about to change forever. "We're not sure about anything," I replied. But the alternative is watching her load willingly into a transport truck because she thinks humans mean food and comfort. Ben started with the generators, just two small ones positioned upwind so the noise and smell would carry naturally. The moment they roared to life, Bracken's head snapped up, ears swiveling to locate the threat. Good. That was the response we wanted. But instead of bolting as we'd hoped, she trotted toward the sound, neck arched with curiosity. After weeks of associating mechanical noises with Ben's arrival and the various equipment that had helped save her life, the generators represented investigation rather than evacuation. Phase 1, Jocelyn said quietly, triggering the air horns in a pattern designed to mimic the calls drift teams used to move ponies. The sharp blasts echoed across the paddock, but Bracken merely startled, then resumed her approach. It was Ben who escalated to Phase 2. He emerged from behind the equipment shed wearing a bright yellow reflective vest and carrying a long pole with more reflective tape attached. The moment Bracken saw him, she whinnied in recognition and picked up her pace. "No," he said firmly, raising the pole and moving toward her in the aggressive, herding posture the drift teams would use. "No, Bracken. Away." What happened next broke something inside me. Ben began the systematic destruction of every positive association Bracken had formed with human presence. When she approached, he made himself large and threatening. When she tried to interact, he created uncomfortable pressure that forced her to move away. When she called to him in confusion, he responded with harsh noise and intimidating gestures. I watched my sister's face crumple as Bracken's friendly curiosity transformed into bewilderment, then genuine fear. This wasn't training, this was betrayal, and we were all complicit in it. "She doesn't understand," Pippa whispered, tears streaming down her face as Bracken retreated to the far corner of the paddock, head high and nostrils flaring with alarm. "That's the point," Jocelyn replied, but her voice was thick with emotion. "Understanding would mean thinking, and thinking gets wild animals killed. We need pure instinct now." For the next 2 hours, we subjected Bracken to a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare. Every time she showed curiosity about human activity, we made that curiosity costly. Every time she sought comfort or connection, we replaced it with pressure and confusion. The hardest moment came when she looked directly at me over the paddock fence, her dark eyes filled with something that looked like accusation. She'd trusted me completely since that night at Blackmere Tarn, and now I was teaching her that trust was dangerous. I turned away, unable to watch, and found myself face to face with my own reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me had aged years in the past few weeks, her face lined with decisions no one should have to make. "Helena." Barnaby's voice startled me from my dark thoughts. "There's something you need to see." He led me to where Ben had set up monitoring equipment near the property line, pointing to a manila envelope that had been left on our gate post. "Found it 20 minutes ago. No postmark, no delivery truck. Someone wanted us to have this quietly." Inside were photographs, high-resolution images of Lord Harrington in what was clearly a business meeting. The location appeared to be an upscale restaurant, and the men he was dining with looked like they'd never set foot on actual moorland. But it was the documents spread across their table that made my blood boil. Lease agreements for sporting rights. Maps showing proposed hunting preserves. Financial projections for premium game bird experiences on formerly protected moorland. "Son of a bitch," I breathed, studying the images. "He's not reducing pony populations for conservation. He's clearing the land for commercial hunting operations." The photographs were damning, clear evidence that Harrington's environmental concerns were a smokescreen for converting public grazing rights into private profit centers. The disease prevention measures he'd pushed were nothing more than land clearance for paying customers who wanted to shoot imported game birds in a natural setting. Who would have taken these? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Someone who wanted the truth to come out, Barnaby replied. Someone who's been watching Harrington's moves and didn't like what they saw. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Whoever had delivered these photographs knew about the early drift, knew about our situation with Bracken, and wanted us to have ammunition against the man orchestrating it all. But even armed with evidence of Harrington's deception, we couldn't undo what we'd already started with Bracken's fear conditioning. The training had to continue, because the drift was still coming whether Harrington's motives were pure or corrupt. By afternoon, Bracken had learned to associate human approach with immediate flight response. The generators, air horns, and reflective materials had become triggers for evasive action rather than curious investigation. She moved like a truly wild animal now, alert, suspicious, ready to bolt at the first sign of human interference. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like watching someone I loved forget everything good about our relationship. The hardest part is almost over, Jocelyn said, noting my expression as we watched Bracken practice her new avoidance behaviors. Tomorrow, we implement the no-hand protocols. No-hand protocols meant exactly what it sounded like: no physical contact, no hand feeding, no gentle touches that might compromise her fear responses in a critical moment. From this point forward, any human interaction had to reinforce the lesson that people represented danger. That evening, as we reviewed the schedule for Bracken's final 24 hours of preparation, Pippa made an observation that haunted me long after everyone had gone home. "We're teaching her to survive by making her afraid of love," she said quietly. "What kind of life is that?" "The only kind available to her," I replied, though the words tasted like ashes. "And maybe that's enough." But as I watched Bracken settle into her new hypervigilant state, constantly scanning for threats that had once been sources of comfort, I wondered if we'd saved her only to lose everything that made her worth saving. The photographs of Harrington's real agenda lay spread across my desk, evidence that we were fighting a battle much larger than one foal's future. But right now, looking out at Bracken as she practiced the fear responses that might keep her alive, I felt like we'd won the war by destroying everything we'd set out to protect. Tomorrow, we would open the gate. Tomorrow, we would discover whether love disguised as abandonment was strong enough to set someone free. Tonight, I grieved for the trust we'd deliberately broken, even as I prayed it would save her life. The mist clung to the moor like a silver shroud when the three of us made our way to the ancient bridle way at first light. Pippa, Jocelyn, and I walked in silence through the pre-dawn darkness, each carrying pieces of the massive Victorian key mechanism that hadn't been disturbed in over 60 years. Our footsteps left dark impressions in the frost-covered grass, a trail that would soon tell the story of what we'd done here. The gate itself stood like a monument to forgotten times, wrought iron twisted into elaborate curves and patterns, held shut by a lock mechanism so complex it resembled a medieval puzzle. Generations of rust had fused the metal components together, but Ben's careful preparation work over the past days had loosened the worst of the corrosion. "My great-grandfather helped design this locking system," I said quietly, running my fingers over the intricate metalwork. "He wanted to make sure that only someone with genuine need and proper authority could open the passage." Jocelyn examined the mechanism with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of tradition. "And now we're using it to circumvent the very system it was meant to regulate." "No," I corrected her, fitting the first piece of the key assembly into place. "We're using it exactly as it was intended, to provide a path when the official channels fail those who need protection most." The key turned slowly, reluctantly, each click of the tumblers echoing across the silent moor like gunshots. 60 years of weather and neglect had left their mark, but the Victorian engineering held true. When the final lock mechanism disengaged with a deep, resonant clank, I felt something shift in the world around us. The gate itself was another challenge entirely. The hinges had seized with rust and age, and the bottom edge had settled into a groove worn by decades of weather. It took all three of us pushing together to move it even an inch, metal shrieking against metal in protest at being disturbed. But gradually, impossibly, the ancient barrier began to swing open. Morning mist swirled through the widening gap, carrying scents from the National Trust land beyond, wild grass, heather, and something else that made my heart race with hope. The smell of free-roaming ponies. There, Pippa breathed as the gate finally stood fully open. It's done. Through the gap, we could see rolling moorland stretching endlessly into the distance. This was protected territory, managed by the National Trust with a lighter hand than the commercial interests that drove men like Harrington. Here, ponies could roam according to ancient patterns, following routes their ancestors had traveled for centuries. But opening the gate was only half the battle. Now came the part that would determine whether all our preparation had been enough. We returned to the paddock where Bracken waited, her newly trained wariness evident in every line of her body. She stood at the far end of the enclosure, watching our approach with the kind of alert tension that might keep her alive in the wild. The trust that had once brought her running to greet us was gone, replaced by the careful assessment of a creature that had learned to evaluate every human interaction for potential threat. "She's ready," Jocelyn observed, noting Bracken's posture and body language. "Look how she holds herself now, balanced, prepared to move in any direction. That's not a domestic animal anymore." I felt a stab of grief at the observation, even though I knew it represented success rather than loss. The eager, affectionate foal who had once sought comfort in human presence had been transformed into something harder, more self-sufficient. More likely to survive. Ben appeared through the morning mist, his equipment pack slung over his shoulder and his expression grim with purpose. "Reconnaissance vehicles spotted 2 miles south," he reported. "We've got maybe an hour before they reach this sector." An hour. Suddenly our careful timeline compressed into desperate urgency. "Open the paddock," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "No herding, no guiding. Just open the gate and let her choose." Pippa's hands shook as she worked the paddock latch, but her movements were decisive. This was the veterinarian who had pulled Bracken back from hypothermic death, and she would see this through to whatever end awaited us. The paddock gate swung open with barely a sound. Bracken lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she tested the air currents flowing through the opening. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, processing information her human-raised senses were still learning to interpret. Then she took a step forward. Another. Her movements were cautious but purposeful, each placement of her hooves careful and considered. This wasn't the panicked flight response we'd trained her for, this was investigation, evaluation, decision-making at its most primal level. "Come on, girl," I whispered under my breath, though I kept my distance and made no move to influence her choice. "Remember what you are." Bracken reached the paddock entrance and paused again, her head turning toward the open bridleway in the distance. The wind carried new scents to her, wild scents, free scents, the complex chemical messages that wild ponies used to communicate across vast distances. Her ears pricked forward with sudden intensity. From somewhere beyond the bridleway came a sound so faint I almost missed it, the distant call of another pony. But Bracken heard it clearly, her whole body vibrating with recognition and longing. "That's her mother," Pippa said with absolute certainty. "That's Moorwind calling." As if in response to her name being spoken, Bracken whinnied back, not the confused, seeking call of a lost foal, but the strong, clear announcement of a pony ready to rejoin her kind. The sound echoed across the moor, and within moments, it was answered by multiple voices from the National Trust land. "The whole family group is out there," Jocelyn breathed. "They've been waiting." But even with her family calling to her, Bracken hesitated at the threshold between captivity and freedom. She turned back toward us, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that looked like gratitude. Not the simple appreciation of a dependent creature for its caretakers, but the deeper acknowledgement of one being for another's sacrifice. Then she made her choice. Bracken broke into a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop toward the opened bridleway. Her movements were fluid and powerful, carrying her across the frost-covered grass with the grace of something born to run free. As she passed through the ancient gateway, I felt something break inside my chest, not the sharp pain of loss, but the deeper ache of love finally expressed through letting go. She didn't look back. Through the bridleway opening, we could see her continuing across the National Trust moorland, her dark form gradually becoming smaller against the vast landscape. From multiple directions, other ponies were converging on her position, the family group that had been searching for her since that terrible night at Blackmere Tarn. "There," Pippa said, pointing to a larger shape approaching from the east. "That's got to be Moorwind." Even at this distance, we could see the scarred mare's distinctive movement pattern, the slight favoring of her right side that matched the injuries visible in our night vision footage. She approached Bracken with the cautious dignity of a mother who had never given up hope, and when they met in the middle of a small valley, the reunion was everything we could have wished for. The mare circled her lost foal, inhaling her scent, checking for injury, reasserting the bonds that had been severed by storm and circumstance. Other ponies from the family group joined them, siblings, cousins, the complex social network that would now protect and guide Bracken through her life as a wild creature. "She's home," Jocelyn whispered, and her voice carried the weight of prayer and benediction. But even as we watched the reunion unfold in the distance, the practical realities of what we'd done began to settle around us. We had opened a legal passage that had been sealed for generations. We had facilitated the movement of a registered pony from controlled to protected territory. We had acted without official permission in the face of an emergency drift order. There would be consequences. Phone calls, investigations, possibly legal action. Lord Harrington would not take this circumvention of his plans quietly, and the various agencies involved in moorland management would demand explanations for our actions. But as I watched Bracken disappear over a distant ridge, running free with her reunited family, I found I couldn't summon any regret for what we'd done. "The gate mechanism," I said to Ben. "Can we reset the locks?" He shook his head. "Once it's been opened, the internal springs can't be rewound without specialized tools. This bridleway is open now until someone with proper authority decides to seal it again." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Maybe it's time for some of these old passages to stay open. Maybe we need more ways for wild things to move freely between the spaces we've carved up and claimed." Pippa was crying openly now, but they were tears of release rather than grief. "We did it," she said wonderingly. "We actually did it. She's free. Free, and alive, and running with her own kind across moorland that had been shaped by her species for 1,000 years. Whatever happened next, whatever legal battles or bureaucratic complications arose from our actions, this moment made it all worthwhile. As we walked back toward Ashford Court, the ancient bridleway standing open behind us like a promise, I felt the weight of family history settling into a new configuration. My ancestors had built this passage to protect the wild heart of Exmoor. Today, we had proven that some traditions were worth preserving, even when they required us to break newer rules in service of older truths. The moor was waking up around us, birdsong replacing the silence of dawn, and somewhere in the distance, I could still hear the calls of ponies welcoming one of their own back into the fold. We had kept our promise. Bracken was free. The storm came without warning, as they often do on Exmoor. One moment we were watching Bracken's distant figure moving confidently across the National Trust lands, and the next, the sky had darkened to an ominous pewter that spoke of serious weather ahead. Lightning flickered on the horizon, still too far away for thunder, but close enough to make the air itself feel electric and dangerous. "We should head back," Pippa said, though her voice lacked conviction. Neither of us wanted to leave, not when Bracken was still visible as a small dark shape among the heather. We'd opened the gate and given her freedom, but letting go completely was proving harder than any of us had anticipated. "Just a few more minutes," I replied, pulling my weather jacket tighter against the rising wind. "I want to see her settle with the herd before we lose sight completely." Jocelyn had been silent since we'd watched Bracken disappear over the first ridge, her binoculars trained steadily on the middle distance where we'd last seen movement. Now she lowered them, her expression troubled. "The storm's moving faster than the weather service predicted," she said. "And it's going to be a big one. The ponies will seek shelter, which means if Bracken hasn't integrated with a group yet." She didn't need to finish the sentence. A lone pony caught in open moorland during a severe thunderstorm faced deadly risks. Lightning strikes, flash flooding from the numerous streams that crisscrossed the landscape, and the simple danger of becoming disoriented in the chaos of wind and rain. The first fat raindrops began to fall as we made our way back toward the bridle way, but they carried an intensity that promised much worse to come. Within minutes, what had started as scattered drops became a steady downpour, then a driving deluge that turned the world grey and indistinct. "There," Pippa shouted over the increasing roar of wind and rain, pointing toward a cluster of movement perhaps half a mile away. "I can see them." Through the sheets of rain, dark shapes were moving with the purposeful urgency of creatures seeking shelter. Even at this distance, we could make out the characteristic silhouettes of Exmoor ponies, their sturdy bodies and distinctive manes unmistakable even in the deteriorating visibility. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white fire, and in that instant of illumination, we saw them clearly. 7 ponies moving in tight formation across the moorland, their bodies leaning into the wind, their movements coordinated with the fluid precision that comes from generations of surviving storms together. And there, at the edge of the group, a smaller figure struggling to match their pace. "Bracken," I whispered, though the word was lost in the thunder that followed the lightning strike. What we witnessed next was one of the most beautiful and terrifying things I'd ever seen in my life. The lead mare, and there was no question she was the leader, her scarred flank visible even through the rain, had positioned herself slightly ahead of the group, reading the landscape and weather patterns with the instinctive wisdom of a creature born to this environment. Behind her, the other adults formed a protective semicircle around the younger animals, including Bracken. But Bracken was struggling. Her smaller size and relative inexperience with group movement patterns meant she kept falling behind or moving out of position. Each time she lagged, the adults would slow their pace, calling to her with vocalizations that carried clearly even over the storm noise. "They're teaching her," Jocelyn breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "Look at the mare on the left, see how she keeps positioning herself to guide Bracken back into formation. That's not just tolerance, that's active instruction." Another lightning flash revealed the herd moving toward a copse of ancient trees that offered some protection from the wind. But as they reached the shelter, something extraordinary happened. The lead mare, the one we'd identified as Moorwind, stopped at the edge of the grove and turned back toward Bracken. Through the driving rain, we watched as mother and daughter approached each other with the careful deliberation of creatures performing an ancient ritual. Moorwind extended her neck, breathing deeply of Bracken's scent, while Bracken mirrored the gesture. Then, in a movement so subtle I almost missed it, the mare lowered her head and touched her muzzle to Bracken's forehead. The recognition was complete. The reunion was official. But it was what happened next that made me grab Pippa's arm in excitement and disbelief. The other ponies in the herd began to approach, each one performing their own abbreviated version of the scent and touch greeting. Not the aggressive challenges that might greet an intruder, but the welcoming gestures reserved for family members returning home. One by one, they accepted Bracken into their social structure, acknowledging her place in the protective formation they'd maintained throughout the storm. "She's in," Pippa said, her voice cracking with emotion. "They've accepted her completely." The final member of the group to approach was an older mare, her coat bearing the silver-grey marks of advanced age. She moved with the deliberate dignity of a matriarch, and when she reached Bracken, she performed the most elaborate greeting ritual of all. Extended scent investigation, gentle nibbling at Bracken's neck and shoulders, and finally the formal head lowering that signified complete acceptance. The grandmother, Jocelyn identified quietly. Every Exmoor herd has one, the oldest mare who carries the collective memory of the group. Her approval is the final seal of belonging. Thunder crashed directly overhead, close enough to make us all jump, but the ponies barely reacted. They'd formed a tight circle in the shelter of the trees, their bodies creating additional windbreaks for the smaller members of the group. Bracken stood in the center of this living fortress, protected by centuries of evolved survival strategy. As we watched, soaked to the skin but unwilling to leave, the herd settled into their storm posture. Heads lowered, tails turned toward the wind, they became a single organism designed to weather whatever nature threw at them. And at the heart of it all was Bracken, no longer a rescued foal dependent on human intervention, but a full member of one of England's most ancient wild communities. "We should go," I said finally, though every instinct screamed against leaving her in the storm. "She doesn't need us anymore." But Pippa was staring at something else, her binoculars focused on the lead mare's distinctive markings. "Helena," she said slowly, "look at the star pattern on Morwind's forehead. Really look at it." I raised my own binoculars, squinting through the rain to focus on the mare's face. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The white star marking on Morwind's forehead wasn't just distinctive, it was familiar. The precise shape, the way it curved slightly to the left, the small secondary marking just above the left eye. I'd seen this exact pattern before, sketched in faded ink in the margins of very old documents. "The breeding records," I whispered. "In the Ashford family archives." Jocelyn looked between us, confused by our sudden excitement. "What breeding records?" "My great-great-grandfather kept detailed documentation of every pony that used the old bridle way," I explained, my mind racing through implications I was only beginning to understand. Bloodlines, markings, behavioral traits. He was fascinated by the genetic continuity of the herds. If Morwind carried the same distinctive markings documented in our family records over a century ago, it meant we weren't just witnesses to Bracken's homecoming, we were seeing the completion of a circle that had been broken by storm and circumstance, then restored by careful human intervention and the enduring power of family bonds. "The line continues," Pippa said softly. "Bracken isn't just joining any herd, she's rejoining her ancestral family. The same bloodline that's been using this territory for generations." The storm was beginning to ease, the lightning moving off toward the distant coast, but the ponies remained in their protective formation. As the worst of the weather passed, we could see them beginning to relax, heads lifting to test the air currents, ears swiveling to monitor their environment. Bracken, I noticed, had adopted the same alert posture as the adults. Her head held high, nostrils flaring to catch scent messages carried on the wind, body positioned to move instantly in any direction. The transformation from domestic dependent to wild creature was complete. "Welcome home," Jocelyn said quietly, and though she spoke barely above a whisper, the words carried the weight of ceremony. As if she'd heard, Bracken lifted her head toward our distant position. For just a moment, across the rain-washed moorland, our eyes met. There was no recognition there anymore, we were simply part of the landscape now, no more significant than the rocks or trees. But there was something else in her gaze, something that might have been contentment. The storm clouds were breaking apart, allowing shafts of golden evening light to illuminate the moorland in patches of brilliant green and purple. The herd began to move again, following more wind toward better grazing, their formation loose and natural now that the immediate danger had passed. We stood there in the dying rain, 3 women who had conspired to restore something ancient and precious to its rightful place in the world. Our clothes were soaked, our hair plastered to our heads, and we were probably all catching our death of cold. But I couldn't remember ever feeling more satisfied with the decision in my entire life. As the herd disappeared over a distant ridge, moving deeper into the protected territory where they could roam according to patterns older than human memory, I felt something settle in my chest. Not closure exactly, but completion. The circle begun that night at Blackmere Tarn was finally, truly closed. The storm had passed, and Bracken was home. 6 months after we opened the bridleway, I stood in the same great hall where we'd held the winter charity ball, but this time the gathering was different. The crystal chandeliers cast their warm light over a far more diverse crowd, farmers and conservationists, government officials and local children, journalists and academics, all united by a shared investment in what had become known as the Ashford model of conservation. The room buzzed with anticipation as I prepared to present the formal Ashford Moor Conservation Covenant, a legal framework that had grown far beyond our initial rescue efforts into something that could reshape how Britain approached wildlife management for generations to come. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out over faces that had become familiar over the months of negotiation, planning, and careful legal maneuvering. What started as one family's attempt to save a single foal has evolved into an opportunity to redefine our relationship with the wild places that define us. Margaret Thornfield, the MP who'd been our first major supporter at the charity ball, nodded encouragingly from the front row. Beside her sat representatives from the National Trust, the Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs, and even a few faces from the European Union's Rewilding Initiative who'd travelled from Brussels specifically for this announcement. But it was the absence of one particular figure that made this gathering possible. Lord Percival Harrington's commercial hunting scheme had collapsed spectacularly 3 months earlier when those anonymous photographs found their way to every major newspaper in Britain. The scandal had not only ended his political influence in moorland management, but had also triggered a wider investigation into the privatisation of public grazing rights. The Ashford Moor Conservation Covenant establishes 3 core principles, I continued, clicking through slides that Ben Fletcher had helped prepare. First, the permanent opening of historical wildlife corridors to facilitate natural movement patterns. Second, the creation of emergency intervention protocols that prioritize animal welfare while respecting wild behavior. And third, the establishment of community-based monitoring and stewardship programs that give local people a direct stake in conservation outcomes. The presentation detailed how our hastily opened bridleway had become the prototype for a network of wildlife passages across Exmoor. Rather than fighting the legal frameworks that governed moorland management, we'd worked within them to create new categories of protected movement that honored both ancient traditions and modern conservation science. The Ashford Wilding Trust, I announced, will serve as the permanent stewardship body for this initiative. Funded by private donations, government partnerships, and sustainable tourism revenue, it represents a new model of conservation, one that treats wild animals as partners in landscape management rather than obstacles to human plans. As I spoke, I caught sight of movement through the tall windows that faced the moor. In the distance, barely visible in the afternoon light, a small herd of ponies moved across the landscape with the unhurried confidence of creatures who knew they belonged. I couldn't make out individual animals at this distance, but I liked to imagine that Bracken was among them, now a yearling fully integrated into the complex social dynamics that had sustained her kind for millennia. The questions from the audience were thoughtful and challenging. How would the trust handle conflicts between tourism and animal welfare? What mechanisms existed for adapting the protocols as climate change altered traditional behavior patterns? How could the model be scaled to other regions without losing the local knowledge that made it effective? But it was a question from an unexpected source that cut to the heart of what we'd really accomplished. "Lady Ashford," called a voice from near the back of the room. I looked up to see a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, who'd come with one of the local farming families. "My teacher says you saved a pony from drowning, but my dad says you just let her go. Which one is true?" The room fell silent, waiting for my response to what was perhaps the most important question of the evening. "Both," I said finally. "And that's exactly the point." I walked closer to where the girl sat, drawn by the kind of direct curiosity that adults often lose as they navigate the complexities of policy and politics. "We saved Bracken's life," I explained, "but saving her life meant giving her the chance to live as she was meant to live. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to step back and let someone find their own way." The girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her in a way it had taken me weeks to understand. "But you still helped her?" she persisted. "We did. And that's the other lesson here. Sometimes wild things need human intervention to survive in a world we've changed. But that intervention should always be aimed at restoring their independence, not creating dependence." As the formal presentation concluded and guests moved into smaller groups for discussion and planning, Pippa found me standing by one of the windows, watching the distant movement of ponies across the moorland. "She's out there, you know," my sister said softly. "Tom Whitlock spotted her last week, healthy, confident, running with a group of juveniles her own age. Said she looked exactly like a wild pony should look." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the champagne reception. "Good. That's exactly how it should be." "Any regrets?" Pippa asked. I considered the question seriously. The past months had been challenging in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Legal battles, media attention, endless committee meetings, and the constant balancing act between public interest and private conviction. But regrets? None, I said finally. Though I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if we'd chosen the safe path. If we'd handed her over to the authorities that first week and trusted the system to do what was right. "She'd be dead or domesticated," Pippa replied matter-of-factly. "And we'd have one less bridge between human responsibility and wild freedom." Through the window, I could see Jocelyn Greenfield leading a group of visitors toward the bridle way, no doubt explaining the ecological principles that governed its use. Barnaby Cooper was deep in conversation with agricultural officials about sustainable grazing practices. Ben Fletcher was demonstrating monitoring equipment to a group of university students who'd come to study our methods. What had started as an emergency rescue had become an infrastructure for hope. "Pippa," I said suddenly, struck by an idea that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks. "What would you think about expanding the school program?" My sister looked at me with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for medical diagnoses. "What do you mean?" "I mean bringing children here regularly. Not just for educational visits, but for real participation in the conservation work. Teaching them that they can be part of the solution instead of just witnesses to the problem." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the moor where our great experiment in coexistence played out daily. "You know what that would mean," she said finally. "A complete transformation of how we use this place. No more quiet family estate. No more privacy." "I know," I replied. "And I think our ancestors would approve." As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, I found myself alone in the great hall with the portraits of previous generations of Ashfords looking down from the walls. Men and women who'd made their own choices about duty, tradition, and the proper relationship between privilege and responsibility. The letter from my great-great-grandfather, the one we'd read at the charity ball, sat framed on the mantelpiece now, a permanent reminder of the principles that had guided our actions. But tonight, I felt ready to write my own letter to future generations, to explain not just what we'd done but why it mattered. Outside, a gentle wind stirred the ancient trees that surrounded Ashford Court, carrying with it the complex sense of moorland life, grass and heather, stone and stream, and the indefinable essence of creatures living free according to their own ancient rhythms. Somewhere out there, Bracken was settling in for the night with her herd, protected by the collective vigilance of animals whose survival strategies had been perfected over centuries. She was no longer the half-drowned foal I'd pulled from the ice, no longer the dependent creature who'd looked to humans for every need. She was something better, a bridge between worlds, proof that love sometimes means letting go, and evidence that human intervention, carefully applied, could serve wildness rather than diminish it. The gate we'd opened would remain open, not just as a physical passage but as a symbol of what became possible when we chose collaboration over control, when we honored the wild heart of the places we called home. In my study later that night, I began to write. To whoever inherits this responsibility after I'm gone, the moor does not belong to us. We belong to the moor. Our job is not to manage its wildness, but to ensure that wildness has room to flourish. Sometimes that means opening gates that have long been closed. Sometimes it means stepping back and trusting in processes older and wiser than our understanding. Always, it means remembering that our greatest power lies in knowing when not to use it. As I wrote, I could hear the distant sound of the bridleway gate chain moving gently in the night wind, not the clank of metal being forced open, but the soft whisper of a passage that would remain open for whatever needed to move between the human world and the wild spaces beyond. The Ashford Wilding Trust would ensure that this passage, and others like it, remained available for generations to come. But the real legacy wasn't in the legal documents or conservation protocols. It was in the understanding that true stewardship meant serving something larger than ourselves, something that didn't need our permission to exist but might occasionally benefit from our help to flourish. Somewhere out on the moor, Bracken was living the life she'd been born for, free and wild and exactly where she belonged. And that, more than any policy or program, was the true measure of our success. The gate was open. The future was unwritten. And the moor continued its ancient conversation between earth and sky, predator and prey, human ambition and wild wisdom. It was enough. It was everything.